All right, so you want to take a deep dive into Jeffrey Dahmer, huh? Buckle up, because this one's, well, it's going to be a heavy one. You've brought in a whole stack of articles about him, the Milwaukee Monster, as they call him. Just saying that name kind of sends chills down your spine, and for good reason. We're talking about a level of brutality that's, well, it's almost beyond comprehension. It'd be easy to get lost in all the gruesome details, but I get the feeling you're after something more, aren't you? You want to try to wrap your head around what could possibly drive a person to commit such horrific acts.
It's a question that's haunted really anyone who's studied criminals, psychologists for decades now. How does someone become a Jeffrey Dahmer? And, well, there's no simple answers, that's for sure, but the articles you've dug up do offer some pretty compelling clues, especially, I think, when we start to look into his early life.
Yeah, okay. So let's rewind all the way back to the beginning. Dahmer was born in Milwaukee back in 1960. And skimming through these articles, it's clear that there were signs, even in childhood, that something was deeply, deeply troubled. Kind of like, you're looking for those little cracks in a building's foundation before the whole thing just crumbles.
Exactly. Several of these articles mentioned this early fascination Dahmer had with death. And I'm not talking about like a normal kid kind of curiosity. This was different. I mean, by the time he was 10 years old, he was actively collecting dead animals, even taking them apart. Most kids, death is this abstract thing, right? But for Dahmer, it seems like it was this gruesome, almost obsessive interest.
Man, that's disturbing on so many levels.
Yeah.
And what really strikes me is that it wasn't just happening in isolation.
Yeah.
His family life, from what I'm reading here, sounds incredibly chaotic. His parents, they were constantly fighting, eventually ended up divorcing. Could that kind of instability, that sense of being abandoned, I mean, could that have played a part in his psychological development, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Trauma, especially during childhood, it can manifest in, well, unpredictable and often really destructive ways. Kids, they depend on their caregivers for safety, for stability. It's fundamental. And when that foundation is shaken, it can have a huge impact on how they develop emotionally and psychologically.
And if I wasn't bad enough, there's this chilling detail about his father. He was a chemist. And get this, he actually showed Dahmer how to preserve animal bones using chemicals. It's like some kind of unintentional apprenticeship for something far, far more sinister.
It's a haunting detail, isn't it? It really speaks to how nature and nurture can intertwine in such complex and disturbing ways. Was this early exposure to death and, well, dissection, was it some warped attempt at bonding, or was it like a catalyst that pushed him down an even darker path? It's impossible to say for sure, but it's definitely a crucial piece of the puzzle.
And then, at just 18 years old, Dahmer commits his first murder. He picks up a hitchhiker, a young guy named Stephen Hicks, invites him back to his place, and, well, that's where the real horror story begins.
And it's crucial to emphasize this wasn't some crime of passion or a spur-of-the-moment thing. The sources describe a calculated, methodical killing. Dahmer bludgeoned Hicks, strangled him, dismembered his body, and then scattered the remains in the woods. That level of premeditation, especially at such a young age, it's deeply, deeply unsettling.
It's wild to me, after killing Hicks, there's this gap, like almost 10 years, where Dahmer doesn't kill again.
Yeah.
He joins the army, gets discharged, kind of keeps his head down. It's like this eerie calm before the storm. Do you think, was he suppressing these urges this whole time? Or was there something else going on in his mind that we haven't, I don't know, maybe these articles don't even touch on?
That's a question that keeps a lot of people up at night, especially folks who study criminal behavior. Was it really a period of dormancy, or was he like developing coping mechanisms, as twisted as they might have been, to function? It's like, a volcano, just because it's quiet doesn't mean it's not capable of erupting again.
Right, of course. Okay, so then 1987 rolls around and the killings start again with Stephen Tuomi. And this is where it gets even more, I don't know, unsettling to me. Dahmer claimed he didn't remember killing Tuomi at all. How is that even possible?
Well, that points to a phenomenon you see in a lot of cases that involve extreme violence. It's called dissociation. Basically, it's the mind's way of protecting itself, detaching from really traumatic experiences. Imagine your mind faced with something so horrific that it just can't process it, so it just hits the pause button on being fully aware.
So you're saying this memory loss, it's like a common thing in these types of cases?
It's more common than you might think, yeah. But of course, it's crucial to remember every case has its own quirks, its own specific circumstances. Dahmer, for example, he also struggled with alcohol abuse. And as we know, that can really impair judgment and lead to blackouts. So you have to try to untangle those factors to get a clearer picture of what really happened.
It's a scary thought. The idea that someone could do something so brutal and have zero memory of it. And tragically, this was a turning point, it seems. After Tuomi, the articles all seem to agree Dahmer's crimes escalate. They happen more frequently, they become more brutal, the details even more disturbing.
Yeah, and this is where his, what we call his modus operandi, his pattern of behavior, it really comes into focus. It's horrifying, but it's clear he targeted vulnerable young men, often minorities, lured them back to his apartment. He'd promised them money, alcohol, companionship, anything to get them there.
And then, well, the things he did are almost impossible to talk about. We're talking drugging, strangulation, dismemberment, cannibalism, even necrophilia, which is, for listeners who might not know, a sexual attraction to corpses.
Mm.
It's a level of depravity that's just, it's hard to even grasp.
Yeah, and even within this horrifying narrative, there's this one detail that stands out, even to me, as particularly disturbing. Dahmer, he tried to create what he called zombies. He'd inject acid or sometimes even pour boiling water into his victims' skulls.
Oh, God, that's chilling. It's like something straight out of a horror movie.
Mhm.
It makes you wonder, what was he trying to achieve with that? Was it about control? Did he want some twisted form of companionship that went beyond death?
Those are exactly the questions that keep criminologists, psychologists, everyone who studies the criminal mind fascinated and frustrated at the same time. This wasn't just about taking lives, it was about this need for absolute power over another human being. Some experts believe this whole zombie thing, it suggests a need for complete control, to have these men, at least in Dahmer's mind, alive but stripped of their own will, existing only for him.
It's a terrifying thought, and it makes his apartment all the more horrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, when the police finally got into his Milwaukee apartment back in '91, it wasn't just a crime scene. It was like walking into a nightmare.
It was a scene of pure carnage. Imagine human skulls, skeletons, organs preserved in jars in the refrigerator, photographs of his crimes, barrels filled with acid that he'd used to dissolve bodies. Every single detail just added another layer of horror to the whole thing.
It's almost unfathomable, that a human being could live like that, surrounded by such darkness. It's a stark reminder, I think, that the most monstrous acts, they often happen behind closed doors, hidden in plain sight.
And as disturbing as these trophies are, they give us a glimpse, a really grim one, but a glimpse nonetheless into Dahmer's mind. These weren't just remnants of his crimes, they were physical representations of the power and control he so desperately craved in his life.
It's mind-blowing,
Yeah.
that someone could commit such horrible acts for so long. The scale of it is just, I don't know, unfathomable. But Dahmer's reign of terror, it did end, and it makes you wonder, what was it that finally brought this house of horrors crashing down?
It's almost tragically ironic, isn't it, that a man who could plan these awful acts so meticulously could be undone by, well, a simple twist of fate. Dahmer was only caught because one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape and got the attention of the police.
Yeah, that sends shivers down my spine just thinking about it. How close Dahmer came to claiming another victim. And Edwards, man, his bravery, not just to escape, but to actually lead the police back to that apartment. It's hard to overstate how crucial that was.
Absolutely, it shows you the kind of courage people can find, even when they're facing unimaginable terror. Edwards' actions, they were the turning point, the end of this nightmare. And once Dahmer was in custody, well, the justice system, for all its flaws, it did its job.
15 consecutive life sentences, right? Which added up to, what, over 900 years behind bars. A sentence that, at least symbolically, reflected the sheer horror of what he did. No chance of parole. Dahmer was never going to see the outside of a prison cell again.
And even in prison, Dahmer's case, it never stopped fascinating people, and confusing them too. He claimed he felt remorse for what he'd done, said he'd found God, even got baptized. But for a lot of people, it just felt hollow, especially when you consider the immeasurable pain and suffering he inflicted.
Right, it raises that question that's probably as old as time, doesn't it? Can someone who's done such unspeakable things ever truly find redemption? It's one of those questions without an easy answer, something people will probably still be debating for years to come.
It speaks to that duality we all have inside us, the capacity for immense good and horrifying evil, all within one person. And with Dahmer, well, that duality was on full display. Even after everything he did, some people still tried to understand the man behind the monster.
And experts have tried, haven't they? Tried to understand his psychology, make sense of it all. What have we learned from studying his case all these years?
It's a case that still fascinates and frustrates in equal measure, that's for sure. There are theories, of course. Borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, even psychotic disorder, these have all been suggested. These disorders often involve having trouble regulating emotions, distorted thinking, even in some cases, a disconnect from reality. But it's important to remember Dahmer was never actually diagnosed with any of these conditions, and even if he had been, it doesn't excuse his actions, not in any way.
Dahmer offered his own explanations too, didn't he? Talked about loneliness, feeling abandoned, needing to be in control. How do those claims fit into all of this?
It's natural to look for easy answers, try to find a single reason to explain such horrific behavior, but the truth is always more complicated than that. And while we need to understand the factors that might have contributed, the trauma, the possibility of undiagnosed mental health problems, the societal prejudices he might have internalized, we can't let understanding turn into excusing. Those are two very different things.
Absolutely. And as much as we want to grasp the why behind Dahmer's actions, we can't forget about the real human cost. His crimes left a permanent scar on the families of his victims, on Milwaukee, on society as a whole, really. Their pain is a constant reminder of the devastating impact of these monstrous acts.
That's right. You have to bring it back to that. The consequences of Dahmer's crimes, the sheer scale of the loss and the trauma, it's impossible to ignore. And what makes it even more tragic is that law enforcement had opportunities to stop him, opportunities they missed, and that just makes the pain even sharper.
You're talking about cases like Konorak Sinthasomphon, the 14-year-old boy who actually managed to escape from Dahmer's apartment. But the police, they actually took him back to Dahmer. The details of that case are still hard to even read about.
It's a heartbreaking example of how systemic bias in this case, both racial and homophobic, can have such devastating real-world consequences. Sintha Sum was a young Laotian boy, and the police, they dismissed the concerns of the black woman who tried to intervene. They didn't see the danger he was in.
It's a chilling reminder that we can't ever let our guard down when it comes to fighting prejudice and injustice, whatever form it takes. The price of indifference, well, it could be truly devastating.
Absolutely. Dahmer's case, it ripped the bandage off those systemic failures. It forced us to confront the issues of police accountability, racial bias, the vulnerability of marginalized communities, and that's a conversation that we still need to be having today.
There's a lot to unpack here, even with all these articles you brought in. And I guess for me, there's still this one question that lingers. How can we reconcile the fact that human beings are capable of both immense good and such unimaginable evil, especially in cases as extreme as Jeffrey Dahmer's?
That is the question, isn't it? And I don't think there are any easy answers. But maybe that's where the real work begins in wrestling with that complexity and recognizing the potential for both darkness and light within ourselves and within society as a whole. That's how we honor the victims and how we try to create a world where such horrors are never repeated.